Dr. Torgeir Fjeld from Oriental Center for Philosophy and the Arts presenting a speech, Being Ruptured, Bruce Lee's Liberation as Event. Doctor, do you need anything?
No, it looks fine. Can you hear well?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. And the slide is up?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, all right, great. Well, first, thanks for a great conference and a very technically proficient execution. This is a paper that is developed from 20 years back. Was working on a PhD with Roehampton University in the UK, and this was part of that research for a degree in philosophy of sports. So we will return to that during the paper, but this is about a development of that topic. Bruce Lee talks about liberation in his texts, and we will discuss this as an event in this paper. There is a trauma at the core of our experience. There is a trauma at the core of our experience of Bruce Lee. And we can go on and we can say there is a trauma at the core of Bruce Lee's experience of himself. We expect and take for granted that our being in the world is whole and sutured, stitched together. This is the reason that we often hear in sociology that what lies at the heart of social disorder is a fragmented sense of identity. When those who are vulnerable get a better sense of themselves as entire persons, as whole beings, we hear, society will also heal. The very word healing is connected to this notion. When we are wounded or when we are in parts, we reach out for healing to become whole. We have gotten so used to this that we regulate our social interaction also as academics according to such complete units. Disciplines and, for Bruce Lee, styles are separated into camps, and for each of them there are discrete and exhaustive sets of apparatuses, practices of assessment and dissemination that should not and cannot be mixed. Can we, in this very novel discipline of martial arts studies, which we surmise is merely about 10 years old, expect a more complex approach to disciplinary work? We ask this because what we attempt to do in this paper is to flush over the edges of martial arts studies with psychoanalysis, philosophy, and aesthetics. In what we are calling the sociological reading of the phenomenon that is Bruce Lee, there is much that is true. The distribution of his films and, to a lesser extent, his writing has created a popular figure of the self-conscious Oriental, an impenetrable Iron Man from the East with the might to crush his Colonial Master. His early demise in 1973 was shrouded in mystery and speculations, and these speculations about what caused his death have carried on, even though the evidence seems to be clear. We will not go into that here. So Lee stands as a figure of danger and sort of this embodied human force that stands in contradiction to an increasingly technically advanced age where science and their machines do the fighting on our behalf, drones and what have you. This might be one of the reasons that we find martial arts in many contemporary science fiction films type The Matrix. Here Lee and his fighting techniques serve as a contrast to the fragmentation we experience in our hurried and demanding world. Lee is an icon for the embodied fighter, the underdog who, against all odds, has the capacity to succeed against this impending darkness. His is a promise in this view of a lost wholeness or a totality that can be retrieved. So what then with the rupture, the wound of Bruce Lee? The answer is that when we approach the image of Bruce Lee as a whole, as sutured totality, we are quickly confronted with its fractured nature. What we will try to show here is how these fractures come out in a psychoanalytic, philosophical, and aesthetic approach to the figure that is Bruce Lee. In other words, what we try to accomplish is a supplementary reading to the sociologically oriented perception of Lee. For isn't the emergent story of martial arts precisely one of identity formation? We learned that prior to 1973, there wasn't really anything such as martial arts in the English language. It was Bruce Lee and the film Enter the Dragon that gave this concept and its attendant imagery, imaginary figure and subject, the martial artist, to our culture. Further, we learn an absolutely crucial turning point occurred with the release of Wu-Tang Clan's album Enter the Wu-Tang in 1993, a direct reference to the Bruce Lee film, when it became possible to articulate Bruce Lee's counter-colonial fighting with a deeper and more global sense of Black consciousness. Again, the notion that martial arts and its mutations in popular culture could do some healing work for troubled youth features prominent. As we will go on to see, this idea of totality was central also to Bruce Lee's perception of his own practice. So we will now go on to talk about the totality of, for instance, Bruce Lee. Yeah? So the totality of anyone, but it could also be Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee was born in America, but he grew up with his parents in Hong Kong. His father's career as a stage performer must have rubbed off on him because by the time he was 18, he had appeared in around 20 films. Paul Baumann, the British scholar, has pointed out that most fan talk about Lee elevate him as a fighter, and the type of masculinity that we have come to associate with him is one of invulnerability and prowess. However, what this image covers over is that Lee first was an artist and only then a martial artist. In other words, we stand more to gain from investigating his legacy with an emphasis on his art rather than strictly on the fighting. Yeah? This was an approach that promoted the art of fighting without fighting. What emerges out of this is a fighter who actually shied away from fighting to the greatest extent possible. Baumann is quick to point out that Bruce Lee was not the only recognized fighter to avoid combat. However, testimonies from those who did fight him indicate that Lee was most interested in the kind of fighting that looked good on the screen, big kicks and flashy-looking things that he just made up on the spot, as Baumann puts it. In other words, Bruce Lee was an artist, an actor and performer with a keen eye to visual effects. First and foremost, what Lee gave us was an image of a fighter. Thus, with a psychoanalytic view, and more precisely the perspective from Sigmund Freud as it was developed by his French disciple Jacques Lacan, subjects, such as Lee for instance, are entities who are restricted to seeing themselves through their own eyes. We see ourselves only through our own eyes. What that means is that the perspective of wholeness and unity, the body, as a complete and non-fragment entity, can only come from the outside, provided by someone else or by the image of ourselves in the mirror. When the child sees him or herself in the mirror, Lacan says, it discovers for the first time that its own body hangs together. All the limbs are connected. There is an instance, what he refers to as the eye, that can manipulate the image by moving the limbs. Okay, so this is the eye moving the limbs. Yeah? However, and this is key to understanding Lacan, this is an ultimately traumatic encounter with a phantasmatic image. The child sees the image as a kind of ideal, a state in which all our shortcomings and failures, our experience of fragmentation and inadequacy, this can be overcome in this image. In short, the child image in the mirror comes to serve as its ideal ego, and this is a term Lacan takes from Freud. It is a standard against which we come to measure our own sense of shortcoming, and ultimately the example against which we cannot but fail. Our image in the mirror provides us with what Lacan called an orthopedic totality. It's supposed to fit us. This image is supposed to fit us like a shoe on our feet. And when it doesn't, it becomes a source of aggressiveness. And therefore, in the story of martial arts, the central feature of the martial artist, and notably in our case Bruce Lee, as an ideal towards which young people can strive and become healed, appears to be blind to this kind of constitutive fragmentation. With Lacan, we ask if we can ever become whole in this sense, and if any role model or ideal ego can do this kind of work for us. So this is kind of a critique of the sociological, the dominant sociological reading of Bruce Lee and martial arts as a place where young people can find a home and identity for themselves. Yeah. Now, in the second case, we will go on to look at Bruce Lee's totality, and we're going to look at these two quotes here. Yeah. How to find out what Bruce Lee's own philosophy was. There are several possible sources for this, and we will look at some of them in turn. Let's begin with a document that was available on the internet back in 2004, so that's almost 20 years ago now. We should be aware that the internet is a highly shifting matter, and that 15 to 20 years is indeed a very long time in this entity. This particular document on the left on your screen now existed on the website brucelee.com, and though the domain exists anymore, this document doesn't exist today. The header on the document said, documentation written by Bruce Lee in original format. So what can we assume about the authenticity here? We went to ask the expert, and who could have better credentials on this than Paul Baumann, who is now with the University of Cardiff. He is a scholar and a self-confessed lover of Bruce Lee, has published tons of books on him. So within the hour he answers back, and this is a quote from that mail. The traditional packaging and repackaging Bruce Lee quotations under different titles is almost as old as Bruce Lee's tendency to package and repackage quotations from other people under different titles and to attribute authorship to him. In other words, this sounds like it is likely to be a repackaging of his essay, Liberate Yourself from Classical Karate, which is one of the few texts that was definitely authored by him without any sense of borrowing heavily from others. We're going to look at the text mentioned by Baumann here, but first let's uncover the likely source of all these texts. Well, now we have 3 texts in circulation. Yeah? What is clear is that prior to his untimely death in 1973, Lee had written many notes that he probably wanted to assemble into a book. 2 years later, in 1975, his widow, Linda, published a manuscript edited by herself and some of Bruce Lee's collaborators and students. This book, The Tao of Jeet Kune Do, was composed from Lee's notes in various stages of completion. Some of these notes have probably slipped out and become parts of other fragmentary texts, such as the article mentioned by Baumann that was published in Black Belt magazine in already 1973, and possibly also the text found on brucelee.com later in 2004. So what is the reason that we are so interested in asserting the authenticity of these texts? And the answer from a philosophical perspective, of course, the answer is to be found in that the precise framing of certain key themes, or in our case, one particular theme, which we will look at here, since the exact choice of words crucially impact on our decoding of Bruce Lee's philosophy. For instance, the passage from the mysterious 2004 document goes like this, and this is the text on the left side of your screen now. To define Jeet Kune Do as a style is to miss it completely. If JKD is not a style or a method, maybe it is neutral, or maybe it is indifference. However, this is not the case either, for JKD is both at once this and not this. And JKD is neither opposed to styles nor not opposed to them. To understand fully, one must transcend the duality of for and against into one organic whole. And this is the key sentence. Within the absolute, there is simply no distinction. Everything is. The crux of the argument here is that Lee's approach transcends questions of style and method. And this is a central theme that we find throughout all the relevant texts. This transcendence entails that Lee is neither opposed to styles, but also not opposed to them. In other words, his approach goes beyond or transcends styles. In the penultimate sentence of our quote, he brings home this point by urging practitioners to release themselves from the opposition of for and against and embrace the contradictory nature of the opposition itself. However, what we are most interested in is the final sentence. Within the absolute, there is simply no distinction, everything is. Could this really be Lee's own formulation? There are some known sources to Bruce Lee's thinking, and in some of them such transcendental thinking, such overcoming of dualities are fairly common. For instance, in the very title of his posthumously published book, the Tao features as a key to understanding. It does seem fairly certain that Taoism had a profound influence on Lee. I think we know that. Now, what about the text from 1971, the one that, according to Bauman, can certainly be attributed to Lee? In this text, Lee elaborated his fighting style as an approach that neither opposes nor adheres to any style. This is the text on your right. To understand this fully, one must transcend the duality of for and against into one organic unity that is without distinctions. So here in 1971, Lee had emphasized his approach, the transcendence of dualism as a way of fighting. Only in 2004, maybe 1973, we don't know when this was written, had this approach become a fully fledged philosophy that pertained also to issues beyond martial arts strictly. It is only later that we learn that within the absolute there is simply no distinction, everything is. To a philosopher, this is an important matter. While Lee grew up in China, he was born in America and spent much of his adult life there. According to his wife Linda, Lee was an avid reader, also of philosophical works, and he may well have been familiar with the philosophy of Baruch Spinoza, an Enlightenment philosopher with a completely transformative view on divinity. So transformative, in fact, that he was expelled from his faith community on the grounds that his writing was considered atheistic. It is in Spinoza's Ethics that we find the famous formulation of God as a being that is absolutely infinite, that is, a substance consisting of an infinity of attributes of which each one expresses an eternal and infinite essence. So this is almost the exact wording that we find in Lee. So what is at stake here is whether Lee's totality is only a unity of fighting styles, or if we should regard it as an approach to being, a sense in which there is a substance that is absolutely infinite and indivisible. Are we limited to an approach to fighting, or are we talking about a philosophy of life? When we are within this absolute, part of this totality within which there are no divisions, we are certainly in a universe where, as Spinoza put it, there is nothing contingent, where everything is determined by necessity. This may be attractive for a fighter who seeks to outsource her or his agency, to generate a sense in which the fighter is purely reactive, flowing, as Lee put it, like water. But it nevertheless conjures up the idea that there is a subject who is completely determined and utterly powerless to the forces of nature. Is the event of becoming oneself, the moment of liberation then, in Lee, not only an instance of forgetting, an eclipse of the self, but also of self-effacement, and finally of self-denial? So here we get into finally the art of the self that we find in Bruce Lee. Because surely the only sense in which we are completely at one with nature is in our demise, when we are reduced to purely inanimate matter. Further, insofar as our unfolding takes place in a domain that is completely determined, where there is nothing that is excessive, that sticks out or can be subject to chance, there simply is no event. With Alain Badiou, a contemporary French philosopher, we learn that in a natural situation, situations without excesses or singularities, there are no events. And while this does not mean that nothing happens in nature, what it means is that nothing happens to nature from the outside. It is in this very sense that to Badiou, a living cat must be considered a historical situation, since there is at least one evental site that defines the cat. It can die. And when it cannot die anymore, when it is dead, it is no longer historical, it is purely natural. Insofar as this existential event, the event of dying, defines living beings, we are also historical beings, which is to say that we are not exhausted by our historical situation, by our natural situation. There is something that sticks out, the possibility of an event that would overturn the totality, the absolute character of determination. And that event is precisely what enables us to change our destiny. This is us. What is non-natural. It is here that we turn again to the art of the martial artist. For is it not so that it is precisely as an event that the martial artist, Bruce Lee's martial artist, moreover, comes into being? Our claim is that it was this artistic event that broke open the smooth flow of largely racial and colonial perceptions of martial arts. In fact, that brought martial arts into our culture as such. What is key here, however, is that this philosophy, whether as a philosophy of fighting or as a philosophy of life, is not and never has been pure. It isn't purely Eastern, nor purely Western, neither only about fighting, but also not clearly not about fighting. It approaches totalities and as such deals with the philosophical question of the absolute. The liberation of Bruce Lee, then, was and indeed is an event that doesn't promise to heal the rupture of the self, the fighter or being, but that seeks to overcome divisions in order to incorporate them and make them part of our totality, that is us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor, for your speech. Now I have a question for you. What is your private, personal approach to the figure of Bruce Lee? Is he a philosopher or a fighting spirit?
Well, he's both, clearly. But I think in our popular culture, the emphasis have been placed largely on him as a fighter, and not sure that that is a fair assessment. I think he was first and foremost a performer and an artist, but he was clearly a very competent fighter as well. It's just that, you know, if he had only been a fighter, we wouldn't know about Bruce Lee, at least not to the extent today. It was a film such as Enter the Dragon that created martial arts in the English language and in our culture. So I think it is Bruce Lee as an artist that we have to thank for this innovation.